In July 1965, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment, sailed from Okinawa toward the coast of South Vietnam. Commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Leon Utter, the battalion was part of the broader American military commitment then accelerating across First Corps, the 5 northern provinces of South Vietnam, where the Marine Corps had been given responsibility for ground operations. The 7th Marines carried a combat lineage that ran from Guadalcanal through Peleliu and the Chosin Reservoir. None of it would prepare them for what came next. What awaited 2-7 Marines was not a conventional fight with identifiable front lines, but a grinding, dispersed counterinsurgency in terrain that offered every advantage to the enemy. The battalion would remain in Vietnam for more than 5 years, cycling through thousands of Marines, dozens of operations, and some of the most dangerous ground in the entire theater. It is a record that says as much about the nature of the war itself as it does about the unit that fought it. To understand the war 2-7 walked into, you have to understand the situation in First Corps during the summer of 1965. The Marines had landed at Da Nang in March of that year, initially to provide security for the airbase, but the mission expanded almost immediately. General William Westmoreland, commanding Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, wanted American forces conducting offensive operations against Viet Cong main force units. The Marine leadership had a different instinct. Lieutenant General Victor Krulak at Fleet Marine Force Pacific believed the war would be won or lost in the villages. The real contest, Krulak argued, was for the allegiance of the population. Securing the coastal population centers village by village would ultimately isolate the insurgency from its base of support, robbing the Viet Cong of intelligence, recruits, and safe havens. Westmoreland was unconvinced. He wanted the big unit war, the search and destroy operations that would find and fix enemy main force units and destroy them through superior firepower. This disagreement between attrition strategy and population security would shadow every Marine deployment in First Corps for the duration of the war. The battalions on the ground, 2-7 among them, ended up trying to do both, often at the same time. A company might spend a week conducting combined action program patrols in the hamlets around Chu Lai, building relationships with village leaders and training local militia, then be pulled out on 48 hours' notice for a multi-battalion sweep into the Khe Son Mountains. The whiplash between those two missions was not simply a scheduling inconvenience. It reflected a strategic incoherence at the highest levels of command that the men at the bottom could do nothing about except endure. The 7th Marine Regiment arrived in the Chu Lai area in stages during July and August 1965. The regiment fell under the operational control of the 1st Marine Division, which was building its presence in the southern half of First Corps. Chu Lai itself was a recently constructed airfield on the coast of Quang Tin Province, built from scratch on a stretch of sand by Navy Seabees and Marine engineers beginning in May. The base existed to provide close air support to Marine ground forces. Protecting it required controlling the surrounding countryside, which was heavily contested. The Viet Cong 1st Regiment operated freely in the area. The villages and hamlets stretching inland from the coast were honeycombed with tunnels, bunkers, and fortified positions. The terrain south and west of Chu Lai alternated between flooded rice paddies, dense tree lines, and broken hill country that climbed toward the Annamite Mountains along the Laotian border. This was country that swallowed battalions whole. Before 2-7 reached Chu Lai, however, the battalion had its first taste of Vietnam in a different part of the country entirely. Elements of the battalion conducted operations in the Quy Nhon area of Binh Dinh Province in 2nd Corps during the initial weeks of their deployment. The work was typical of the early war. Search and destroy sweeps through villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong infrastructure, patrols through terrain infested with caves and hideouts, ambushes set in the hills and valleys west of the coastal city. The battalion was essentially paving the way for the larger army buildup that would follow in Binh Dinh. It was unglamorous and exhausting work, conducted in monsoon rains that turned every trail into a creek and every foxhole into a pond. The Marines dealt with malaria, heat casualties, and an enemy that chose when and where to fight before melting back into a population that looked identical to the people the Americans were ostensibly protecting. This was the fundamental problem of the war distilled to its simplest terms. It confronted 2-7 from their very first patrols. Once consolidated at Chu Lai, the battalion settled into a cycle of operations that would define its existence for years. The operational rhythm was relentless. There was no rear area in any meaningful sense. Marines rotated between company-sized operations in the field, platoon and squad patrols closer to the base, and defensive duties on the perimeter. But there was no period when the battalion was truly stood down. The southern half of 1st Corps was, by 1966, a patchwork of contested districts where government authority extended only as far as the nearest armed outpost. The Viet Cong taxed, recruited and governed in the spaces between. The Marine response was to maintain a constant presence in the field, hoping to generate contact on terms favorable enough to bring American firepower to bear. The logic was sound in principle. In practice, it meant 2-7 spent most of their time walking through country where the enemy held the advantages of concealment, local knowledge, and the ability to break contact at will. A typical company-level operation might involve 2 or 3 days of patrolling through paddies and tree lines, a handful of sniper incidents or brief exchanges of fire, and a return to base with a few casualties and an uncertain accounting of what had been accomplished. The large operations attracted attention and generated after-action reports. The daily grind of small unit patrolling, where most of the dying actually happened, went largely unrecorded. December 1965 brought the battalion into its first major multi-battalion engagement. Operation Harvest Moon was a joint Marine and ARVAN operation in the Quai Son Valley, a fertile, rice-rich lowland in western Quang Tin Province that the Viet Cong considered essential to their supply network. The operation was prompted by a rapidly deteriorating security situation. In late November, the VC 1st Regiment had overrun the regional force garrison at the district capital of Hiep Duc at the mouth of the valley. The ARVAN counterattacks that followed had been badly mauled. On December 8th, ARVN forces, advancing along Route 534 toward Hiep Duc, walked into a series of ambushes. The 11th Ranger Battalion was overrun within 15 minutes, losing a third of its strength. The following morning, the VC hit the ARVN 1st Battalion position, overrunning its command post and killing the regimental commander of the 5th Regiment. The situation was coming apart, and 3 Marine Amphibious Force activated Task Force Delta to restore it. The 2-7 Marines were landed by helicopter 9 kilometers west of the ARVN positions on the morning of December 9th and began moving northeast. The battalion established a defensive position by late afternoon and spent the next several days pushing through the valley in a hammer and anvil maneuver designed to squeeze the VC between converging Marine and ARVN columns. The fighting that followed was confused and costly. On December 10th, Company E of 2-7 was ordered to assist a pinned-down company from the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, which had landed at a contested helicopter zone near the hamlet of Kamla and immediately come under heavy machine gun and mortar fire. Company E came under intense fire on its own flank before it could close the distance. By nightfall, the 2 companies had linked up, but Companies E and F together had lost 20 Marines killed that day alone. Operation Harvest Moon as a whole cost the Marines 90 dead and 91 missing, and the ARVAN 45 killed, against a claimed body count of 407 Viet Cong. The figures told a particular story if you accepted them at face value. The operational reality told another. The VC had chosen the time and place of engagement and then withdrew largely intact. Harvest Moon was declared a success, but the Quai Son Valley remained contested. The VC 1st Regiment was back operating in the area within weeks. It is a pattern that would repeat itself across 1st Corps for years. The command structure above Harvest Moon had its own problems. Brigadier General Melvin Henderson, commanding Task Force Delta, moved his headquarters 3 times in a single day during the fighting on December 10th, severely disrupting communications at exactly the moment when coordination mattered most. Lieutenant General Lew Walt, the 3 MAF commander, relieved Henderson and replaced him with Brigadier General Jonas Platt. This kind of mid-operation command change was unusual and spoke to the difficulty of controlling multi-battalion operations in terrain that degraded radio communications and made helicopter movement hazardous. The lessons were noted. Similar coordination problems would surface in future operations, which suggests they were not fully absorbed. March 1966 brought Operation Utah, which was in many respects a continuation of the same fight in the same region. The ARVN had taken another beating northwest of Quang Ngai, and 3 MAF ordered 2-7 to respond. Colonel Oscar Petros, commanding the 7th Marines, selected Lieutenant Colonel Utter's battalion for the mission. The objective area was a landscape of rice paddies and hamlets in the Shawnai village complex, dominated by Hill 50, a modest rise in the otherwise flat paddy land that offered observation over the planned helicopter landing zone. Utter's Marines were landed on the morning of March 4th after an air and artillery preparation. What they found was a well-prepared enemy, elements of the Pavan 4N 21st Regiment, who had no intention of withdrawing. The fighting around Hill 50 was among the most intense 2-7 experienced in its entire deployment. The NVA had constructed an extensive tunnel and bunker complex inside the hill that served as a regimental command post, and they defended it accordingly. The operation expanded rapidly. The 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, was inserted north of 2-7, and the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, to the south. ARVN Rangers established blocking positions to the east, while an ARVN Airborne Battalion reinforced the original landing zone. The NVA responded with mortar and small arms attacks through the night, probing marine perimeters and launching coordinated assaults. One company from the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, attached to the operation and positioned northeast of the main battle area, was hit by intense fire at 2300 hours and nearly ran out of ammunition before emergency helicopter resupply missions got through, despite heavy anti-aircraft fire. By the time the NVA withdrew on the night of March 5th, they left over 100 bodies on Hill 50 alone. Operation Utah officially concluded on March 7th with 98 Marines killed, 278 wounded, 30 ARVN killed, and a claimed 600 NVA dead. The cost to the battalion was severe. One veteran of 2-7 who was there later called it an absolute mess, where by the end of the fighting he was no longer certain which company he was assigned to or who was in charge. That kind of battlefield confusion, born of casualties among officers and NCOs and the difficulty of maintaining unit integrity in close combat, was not unique to Utah. But it was more acute there than in many engagements. The operation also underscored an emerging reality about the war in First Corps. The enemy the Marines were now fighting included not only Viet Cong guerrillas, but regular NVA regiments, well-equipped and willing to accept significant losses to defend prepared positions. This changed the character of the war for battalions like 2-7 considerably. The VC engagements of 1965, while dangerous, had typically been hit-and-run affairs. The NVA fought differently. Heavier weapons, more disciplined defensive tactics, and a willingness to stand and absorb punishment that the VC had rarely demonstrated. The Marine Corps adjusted its own tactics in response, increasing the allocation of artillery and air support to infantry operations. But the fundamental problem remained. The enemy decided when to fight and when to disappear, and no amount of firepower could compel a decision he was not prepared to make. Through 1966 and into 1967, 2-7 continued its cycle of operations in the southern First Corps area. The battalion worked out of Chu Lai and later expanded its area of operations to include Dai Lok and positions closer to Da Nang. The 7th Marine Regiment headquarters established itself on Hill 55, southwest of Da Nang, and the regiment's 3 battalions, 1-7, 2-7, and 3-7, rotated through sectors that stretched from the coastal lowlands west toward the mountains and south toward An Hoa. The operational pattern was consistent: search and destroy sweeps, cordon and search operations around villages, rice denial missions during harvest season designed to keep hundreds of thousands of pounds of grain out of Viet Cong hands, and defensive patrols around key installations. The 3 MAF Rice Protection Program was one of the few measurable pacification successes during this period, and Marine battalions including 2-7 spent considerable effort guarding harvests and interdicting VC attempts to tax or confiscate rice from local farmers. It was important work that received little attention compared to the larger combat operations, but it spoke to the counterinsurgency dimension of the Marine mission that Krulak had championed. Each operation generated contact at varying levels of intensity. Some were platoon-sized firefights that lasted minutes. Others escalated into company or multi-company engagements requiring artillery and air support. The cumulative effect was a battalion perpetually engaged, perpetually taking casualties, and perpetually receiving replacement Marines who had to learn the ground from scratch because their predecessors had rotated home or been evacuated. The operational tempo never relented. Between named operations, the routine patrolling continued, and it was during these unnamed, uncelebrated patrols that much of the battalion's combat actually took place. The command chronologies for 2-7 during this period, the monthly reports filed by the battalion staff, record a steady drumbeat of contacts, ambushes, mine incidents, and sniper engagements that individually merited no more than a sentence or two in the official record. Collectively, they constituted the actual war as the riflemen experienced it. The replacement system compounded the problem. Unlike the Army, which eventually moved to a unit rotation policy for some formations, the Marines in Vietnam relied on individual replacement throughout most of the war. A Marine joined 2-7, served his 13-month tour, and rotated out while the battalion remained in place. This meant that at any given time, a significant portion of the battalion consisted of Marines with less than 3 months in country, still learning the terrain, the enemy's methods, and the unwritten survival knowledge that experienced troops accumulated over time. The result was a unit that never fully stopped, never fully rested, and never possessed a stable core of experienced personnel for more than a few months at a stretch. Institutional knowledge lived in a handful of senior NCOs and officers who extended their tours. Even that continuity was fragile. It is a dynamic that the broader American military experience in Vietnam shared, but for a battalion that never left the country for more than 5 years, the consequences were felt continuously. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 found 2-7 positioned in the Da Nang tactical area of responsibility. The 7th Marine Regiment under Colonel Ross Minor had responsibility for the northern, western, and southwestern sectors of the Da Nang defense. With the departure of the 5th Marine Regiment to support operations further north, Minor's regiment was the only Marine infantry headquarters in the extensive Da Nang area. The 2nd Battalion held the northern sector. When the offensive struck, Da Nang was targeted by elements of the PAVN and VC 2nd Division, including sapper battalions and local force companies. The attacks were beaten back relatively quickly compared to the catastrophe unfolding at Hue and the prolonged fighting in Saigon. But they demonstrated something that extensive patrolling and intelligence operations had failed to prevent: the enemy's ability to concentrate forces close to major American installations. The 7th Marines and the 1st Marine Division reported between 1,200 and 1,400 enemy killed in the Da Nang area during the Tet fighting, against 142 Allied dead. Those numbers reflected the defensive advantage that American firepower provided when the enemy obligingly attacked fixed positions. This, of course, was precisely why the enemy rarely did so outside the extraordinary circumstances of a coordinated nationwide offensive. The period from mid-1968 through 1969 saw 2-7 operating extensively in and around the Arizona Territory, the desolate stretch of ground between the Vu Ye and Thu Bon rivers northwest of An Hoa combat base. The Arizona was, by most accounts, one of the most dangerous areas in all of 1st Corps. It had been fought over so many times that the original villages and farmland had been reduced to a wasteland of craters, collapsed bunkers, and scrub vegetation. NVA regiments used the Arizona as a transit corridor from the mountains toward the populated coast. Marine battalions rotated through it in an almost continuous cycle of sweeps that produced contact, casualties, and body counts, but never permanent control. A battalion would push through, kill or capture a number of enemy soldiers, destroy some bunkers and caches, and withdraw. Within weeks, the NVA would reoccupy the same positions. The surveillance of the Arizona alone required the continuing attention of at least one battalion at all times, which meant the 7th Marines and its sister regiments were perpetually committed to a piece of ground that consumed resources without producing lasting results. The terrain was flat enough that the NVA could not hide in the conventional sense, but it was laced with fighting positions, spider holes, and tunnels that turned every hedgerow into a potential ambush site. For 2-7, the Arizona became a familiar and dreaded assignment. a place where the operational repetition of the war was most visible. In May 1968, 2 companies of 2-7 crossed the Liberty Bridge onto Gonoy Island as part of Operation Allen Brook, a sustained effort to clear the island and deny it to the enemy as a staging area. Gonoy was a flat, sandy expanse formed by the convergence of the Thu Bon and Vujia rivers. It had been under Viet Cong control for much of the war. The island's population had largely been displaced, and what remained was a landscape of ruined hamlets and fortified positions that the VC and NVA used as a base for operations against the Da Nang Corridor and the An Hoa Basin. The first few days produced only light resistance. By May 9th, the Marines encountered heavy opposition at the hamlet of Xuan Dai, where airstrikes were required before the position could be overrun. That single engagement produced 80 NVA killed. Allen Brook continued through the summer, eventually involving elements of multiple battalions, including companies from 1-7 and 3-7 Marines. It was a grinding operation that exemplified the character of the war in the Arizona. Small unit contacts, booby traps and mines that accounted for a disproportionate share of Marine casualties, and an enemy always present but rarely willing to commit to the kind of stand-up fight that favored American firepower. By the time Allen Brook concluded, the Marines had inflicted significant casualties. Gonoy Island, like the Arizona Territory, would require repeated clearing operations for the remainder of the American presence. The ground, it seemed, could be taken but not kept. During the 1969 Tet Offensive, which was considerably smaller than its 1968 predecessor, NVA sappers attacked Hill 327 and the positions of 2-7 Marines northwest of the hill. Both attacks were repulsed, but at a cost of 18 Marines killed and 80 wounded. The NVA left 75 dead or captured on the wire. These kinds of engagements, brief, violent attacks on Marine positions followed by withdrawal, characterized the later phase of the war in First Corps. The enemy had drawn clear conclusions from Tet 1968. Large-scale ground assaults against prepared American positions were catastrophically expensive. They adjusted accordingly, relying more heavily on rockets, mortars, mines, and small unit ambushes to inflict casualties while preserving their own strength. Throughout this period, half of all Marine combat casualties in the area south of Da Nang came from mines and booby traps, what the Marines called the silent killers. That statistic deserves attention. For every dramatic firefight or pitched battle, there were dozens of incidents in which a Marine on a routine patrol stepped on a pressure-detonated device or triggered a tripwire and was killed or maimed without ever seeing the enemy. The psychological toll was immense. Every step on every patrol carried the possibility of sudden, random violence, and there was no tactical skill or combat experience that could reliably protect against it. The burden fell most heavily on the riflemen and pointmen of the infantry platoons, the Marines who walked the trails and crossed the paddies day after day. It was a form of warfare designed to erode morale rather than win battles, and in that respect it was effective. By 1969, the political context of the war had shifted decisively. The Nixon administration's policy of Vietnamization called for the progressive withdrawal of American forces and the transfer of combat responsibility to the ARV. For the Marine Corps, this meant a phased drawdown in First Corps that would eventually see the entire 1st Marine Division depart Vietnam. The 3rd Marine Division began its withdrawal in the summer of 1969, and the remaining Marine units absorbed its area of responsibility while simultaneously preparing for their own departure. The 2-7 Marines continued operating through this transition, but the strategic logic underlying their missions was increasingly hollow. The battalion was still patrolling, still making contact, still taking casualties, but the objective was no longer to win the war in any conventional sense. It was to maintain pressure on the enemy long enough for the South Vietnamese to assume the burden while American units withdrew in an orderly fashion. The concept depended on an assumption that the ARVN could hold what the Marines were giving up. In some areas, particularly where the ARVN had strong local leadership and adequate support, this proved possible. In others, the transfer of responsibility amounted to handing over contested ground to forces that lacked the firepower, logistics, and institutional depth that the Marines had brought to bear. Whether the ARVN could sustain that burden over the long term was a question most Marines in the field had strong opinions about. though the official line remained optimistic. The gap between what the troops saw on the ground and what the briefings claimed was not a new phenomenon in Vietnam. But during Vietnamization, it acquired a particularly bitter quality. Marines were still dying for ground that everyone understood would be turned over to someone else within months. The battalion departed Vietnam in October 1970, having been continuously deployed in the country for more than 5 years. That duration is significant. Very few American units of any size maintained an unbroken presence in Vietnam for that length of time. The battalion that left bore almost no personnel resemblance to the one that had arrived in 1965. The individual replacement system ensured that the unit's identity was carried by its designation, its colors, and its institutional memory, rather than by any continuity of individual Marines. Thousands of men served with 2-7 over those 5 years. The battalion's casualty figures across its full deployment were substantial, though precise totals are difficult to compile because Marine record-keeping tracked casualties by individual rather than by unit over extended periods. What the record of 2-7 Marines reveals, when viewed as a whole rather than as a sequence of individual operations, is the fundamental character of the Marine War in Southern First Corps. It was a war of attrition fought at the battalion level and below, in which the same ground was contested repeatedly without ever being decisively won or lost. The battalion fought in the Quai Son Valley in December 1965. Marines were still fighting there in 1969. The Arizona Territory consumed companies and platoons for years without producing a strategic result that could be sustained once those units moved on. Operations were launched, contact was made, casualties were inflicted and suffered, and the tactical situation returned roughly to its prior state within weeks. This was not a failure of courage or competence at the battalion level. The Marines of 2-7 fought with the tenacity the Corps expected, and they did so under conditions that tested that tenacity constantly. The failure, to the extent the word applies, was structural. The strategy of attrition assumed that inflicting casualties on the enemy at a sufficient rate would eventually break his ability or willingness to continue fighting. But the enemy's tolerance for casualties proved far higher than American planners had anticipated. His ability to replace losses through infiltration down the Ho Chi Minh Trail remained intact throughout the war, and the political constraints that prevented American forces from attacking the source of those replacements meant the equation could never be resolved through tactical action alone. A battalion like 2-7 could win every engagement it fought and still not alter the trajectory of the war. That is not an indictment of the Marines who served there. It is a description of the war they were asked to fight. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines returned to Camp Pendleton in late 1970 and eventually relocated to 29 Palms. The battalion would deploy again to Desert Storm, to Iraq, to Afghanistan, carrying forward a lineage that stretched back to 1940. But its Vietnam chapter, those 5 years of continuous combat in the paddies and hills and river valleys of Southern First Corps, remains the longest sustained deployment in the battalion's history. The war asked 2-7 to do something that few military organizations have been asked to do: fight continuously, for years, without a clear prospect of decisive victory, in conditions that eroded units as fast as they could be rebuilt. The battalion did what was asked. The question of whether what was asked made strategic sense is one that outlived the war itself.